All right, so let's kind of just go back and review some of the things that we talked about last time, right? Because I think they will actually kind of help us understand what is going on in this story. So what do we remember from our discussions last time about Irish literature and Irish culture in the 19th century? And what do we remember about relations between Ireland and Britain in the 19th century?
A heavy part of the, I'm trying to think for a word for it, but it was not agreeable because of a religious standpoint as well, when it was Catholic versus Protestant.
Okay, yeah, there is a religious divide, right? And that comes into this story, particularly in the figure of Mr. Brown being present at this party. Yeah, so there is, on the one hand, right, a Protestant minority that has most of the political power in the country, right? And much of the wealth. Right. They own most of the land. Whereas there is a Catholic majority that has been politically disempowered since at least the end of the 17th century. But in the 19th century, with the aid of newspapers and corresponding societies and things like that, the stuff that we call like the public sphere, right? By the end of the 19th century, this Catholic majority is starting to push back in a serious way against their subordinate position. Right, so we'll recall from last time we talked about Benedict Anderson and his definition of nationalism, right? So Jordan just mentioned this a moment ago. It's probably a good idea to try to review this. What do we remember about what Benedict Anderson said about nationalism? How did he define it? What is nationalism?
Is it much different from like a standard definition of nationalism that we follow along, or is like specifically?
It's a little more specific. Okay, what's the standard definition you're thinking of?
So like the standard definition that I think about is like blindly following all of the, like dedicating 1000% to your country regardless of the circumstances or who's in power, who's in charge.
And the idea of nation and nationalism are caught up with ideas of race and ethnicity as well, right? So it's less about devotion to the state as it is about devotion to your particular ethnic group or religious group or whatever, right? But yeah, Jordan, you look like you wanted to say something.
He also mentioned imagined community.
Yeah. Yeah, so his book is called Imagined Communities. And yeah, a nation is, for Anderson, literally an imagined community, right? Because most of the other members of the nation you will never meet. But you still think of yourselves as belonging to the same body, right? The same nation. And it's through communication in the public sphere that nationalism, according to Anderson, really kind of comes into being. And newspapers are actually kind of important in a couple of ways to this story. Writing and letters are important to this story for a variety of reasons, as are these kinds of cultural institutions that Jordan alluded to in her presentation. Right? So she talks specifically about cultural nationalism. Right, which is often allied to but distinct from political nationalism, right? And that a cultural nationalist isn't necessarily trying to argue for their particular ethnic group's political power or political separation from others, right? What they are trying to argue for is their cultural distinctiveness. And did I bring up the Irish literary revival last time? Did we talk about that at all last time, or did we kind of gloss over it? Can't remember exactly where we finished that. Okay, so we may have kind of mentioned it quickly, right? So this is kind of a prime example of cultural nationalism. So the Irish literary revival, which you may also in some places see described as the Irish literary renaissance, is usually kind of dated by the kinds of people who like assigning dates and periods to things from about 1880 to 1930. And it really kind of comes in two waves. So the first wave of it is specifically an attempt to create a distinctive Irish literature in English. Right, so English in language, Irish in content, right? Because if you limited your audience to Irish speakers, what do we remember from last time that happened to many of the Irish speakers?
They moved to other places, they relocated.
Yeah, they starved to death during the Great Famine, or they emigrated, right? So yeah, the Irish-speaking population was decimated in the mid-19th century. So, English was basically the language spoken in the island. Although there were attempts to reverse that, which we'll talk about when we discuss Miss Ivers a little bit, right? But yeah, so this first wave, their particular concerns were Irish folklore and mythology, the Irish landscape, the glorification of rural Ireland, particularly the West, over the comparatively urbanized East, right? So, the region of Western Ireland called Connaught, right, over the area around, say, Dublin, Dublin would have been not only the primary, the capital, but also the primary, kind of economic center, and also the political center. It was where the British administration in Ireland was seated. And there was a focus on peasant culture, right, on the rural working class. Now, it is also true that most of the writers in this first wave of the Irish literary revival probably wouldn't have known a real peasant if one walked up and bit them on the ass, right? They were mostly, they were mostly from the upper middle class, Protestant and upper middle class, right? So their connections to this Ireland they regarded as more authentic were often a little tenuous at best, right? But yeah, this in particular, C and D here, right? And this is important to remember for understanding what's going on and what's going to be taken apart in the Dead, is that this is where this first wave of revivalist writers and cultural nationalists this is where they locate authenticity in Ireland, right? this is where they locate the real Ireland. And I think it might help if we actually go to Gabriel's exchange with Miss Ivers now. And we can see here in this some of this attitude, right? So, were you all confused by this exchange between these two people, like about what was going on here and why she was upset with him and why what she said bothered him so much? Okay, I think some, yes, okay, Colin, you were not.
It was kind of like looking at it, at first I was, but then I'm like going back and reading it a couple of times, it's really just her skepticism about him being disloyal to Ireland in general.
Yeah.
Her movement of this cultural nationalism.
Uh-huh.
She wants like for that to be contained, so it's like his desire to go and travel other places rather than travel within Ireland to the actual Irish-speaking nations.
Yeah.
It's almost like she feels if he goes back to like the roots where like they're actually speaking the Irish language and everything like that, the disdain for Ireland and like Dublin in general will kind of dissipate. That's what I felt like.
Yeah, and I think you've got a good read there on where Miss Ivers is coming from. And I think like we can divide these two characters up based on, again, those two terms that Jordan used, nationalism and cosmopolitanism. And I think, Colin, you just gave us a pretty good description or definition of what cosmopolitanism is, right? Cosmopolitanism, like a cosmopolitan literally is a citizen of the world, right? Someone who doesn't attach their loyalty to any specific place or ethnic group or language group or religion, right? A cosmopolitan is someone who, in a positive sense, tries to accept the world and everyone in it on their own terms. As opposed to a nationalist who gives their loyalty specifically to a particular group, right? A particular in-group. So Miss Ivers is speaking for the nationalist position. And Gabriel is speaking for the cosmopolitan position. So let's start here on page 418, and let's kind of note like what the first thing we notice here is about Miss Ivers, the way Miss Ivers is described to us initially. Right? Can somebody read to us starting with Lancers were arranged near the bottom of the page?
Lancers were arranged. Gabriel found himself partnered with Miss Ivers. She was a frank-mannered, talkative young lady with a freckled face and prominent brown eyes. She did not wear a low-cut bodice, and the large brooch, which was fixed in the front of her collar, bore on an Irish device. When they had taken their places, she said abruptly, "I have a crow to pluck with you." "With me?" said Gabriel. She nodded her head gravely. "What is it?" asked Gabriel, smiling at her solemn manner. "Who is GC?" answered Miss Ivers, turning her eyes upon him. Gabriel colored and was about to knit his brows as if he did not understand, and she said bluntly, "Oh, innocent Amy, I have found out that you write for the Daily Express. Now aren't you ashamed of yourself?" "Why should I be ashamed of myself?" asked Gabriel, blinking his eyes and trying to smile. "Well, I'm ashamed of you," said Miss Ivers frankly, "to say you write for a rag like that. I didn't think you were a West Briton." Okay, thanks. We can pause here, right? So first off, what do we notice about the way Miss Ivers' appearance is described? What signals to us here Irish nationalist?
She wore the brooch, which had the Irish device.
Okay, yeah, she's wearing a brooch that has an Irish device, a large brooch, right?
It's that very subtle conservative look that they talk about, because it's like the point about it was the low cut, that it wasn't low cut. It's
Yeah.
that implication that she's very traditional conservative.
Yeah, she's wearing a modest dress, right? She's not showing a lot of cleavage, which suggests an adherence to traditional Catholic morality, right? So that plus the Irish device and her general appearance a freckled face and large brown eyes, all kind of suggest Irishness here, right? And she accuses Gabriel Conroy, her friend and colleague, of being a West Briton, right? So we know that the two of them are about the same age, so they're both roughly 40, right? Now, what else can we tell about Miss Ivers from her name? Not married, yes. Yes, she's Miss Ivers. And we know that she makes her living, like Gabriel does, as a teacher in a college, right? Now, we should be clear here about what college means. In a British Isles context, because it's not the same thing that it means in the U.S. context, right? So in the U.S., a college is it's an institution of higher education, post-high school education, right? In Britain and Ireland, a college is essentially a private high school. But if Miss Ivers is a teacher, what else does that tell us about her? What else must she be?
Educated.
Yeah, she's educated. She and Gabriel are both university educated as well, right? Now, how normal would that be in Britain or Ireland around the turn of the 20th century? Yeah, I mean, not that common for men to be university educated, right? Even less common for women. So how well does Miss Ivers fit into those conventional Victorian stereotypes of women that we've talked about? Yeah, she's 40 years old and unmarried, right? She's university educated, and she works as a teacher. So clearly not an angel in the house, right? So we can cross the angel out here, right? Now there is another discourse about gender that arises at the end of the 19th century that kind of defies both the angel in the house and fallen woman stereotypes, right? There's a figure that's referred to as the new woman. And maybe we'll talk about this a little bit more when we cover Virginia Woolf in a week and a half, right? But the new woman was an independent, educated woman who made her own way in the world and was usually caricatured in the popular press as adopting certain masculine habits, right? She smoked cigars, she drank whiskey, she wore pants, she rode a bicycle, right? And I think that Miss Ivers is given here some elements of this new woman kind of figure, but it's being combined with an Irish Catholic nationalist impulse here as well, right? But then what does she want Gabriel to do? After they have this little spat here, right? Can we move down the page a little bit to when their turn to cross had come, he was still perplexed and inattentive.
When their turn to cross together, again, she spoke with the university question. Wait, is that good?
That's fine. You can start there, that's fine.
When their turn to cross had come, he was still perplexed and inattentive. Miss Ivers promptly took his hand in a warm grasp, and she said in a soft, friendly tone, "Of course, I was only joking. Come, we cross now." When they were together again, she spoke of the university question, and Gabriel felt more at ease. A friend of hers had shown her his review of Browning's poems. That was how she had found out the secret, but she loved the review immensely. Then she said suddenly, "Oh, Mr. Conroy, we've come for an excursion to the Aran Isles this summer. We're going to stay there a whole month. It would be splendid out in the Atlantic. You ought to come. Mr. Clancy is coming, and Mr. Gilkelly and Kathleen will be with me. It would be splendid for Greta, too, if she'd come. She's from Bemidji." Bemidji, Bob?
Yeah, keep going. I'll tell you what's up.
Her people are, said Gabriel shortly.
Okay, let's pause here, right? So to give you some sense of where the Aran Isles and Connacht are, right? So I'm going to draw a not very good map of Ireland. My artistic skills are extremely limited. Right, I'm used to working with text. So here we have our kind of vaguely potato-shaped island the size of New Jersey. So Dublin will be about here, kind of east middle. Connacht would be this region here, which was still largely rural and had more Irish speakers remaining than any other part of the country. And kind of off the coast are these three little rocks in the North Atlantic called the Aran Islands, which occupy an outsized place in the mythology of the Irish literary revival, right? So the Aran Islands, being a place where Irish was still spoken by most people, being a place that was entirely rural and still lived a kind of traditional fishing lifestyle, was regarded by the revivalists and other cultural nationalists as the most authentic Irish experience, right? So to go to the Aran Islands and to go live on the Aran Islands for a little while was to really get in touch with what it meant to be Irish. Right? Huge, like this was as far west as you could go and still be in Ireland, right? You know, there were people, for example, who were, depressed by the fact that the largest hotel, the largest island, Aranmore, by about 1907, had a hotel and a larger population of English speakers, right? No, you're ruining it. But then, of course, what's ruining it is that all these tourists are coming out there and they have to stay somewhere, right? So, this is where Miss Ivers wants Gabriel Conroy to go, right? And what's Gabriel's response to her? Is he the slightest bit interested in going out and roughing it on these little chunks of rock in the Atlantic?
No.
And in fact, how does he even respond when Miss Ivers points out that Greta, his wife, is from Connacht, is from the West?
He says her people are.
Yeah, her people are, he says shortly, right? So he loses his temper a little bit over it. And he only says her people are from there, not Greta herself, right? So what does this suggest about Gabriel's general attitude towards the West and towards this kind of cultural nationalism, particularly if we pair this with his writing for the Daily Express, which is a pro-British newspaper, and the fact that most of the cultural reference points he's talking about throughout the story are British, right? He thinks about Shakespeare, he thinks about Robert Browning, and so on and so forth.
He doesn't align himself with the West.
Does not align himself with the West, right? And then, by extension,
Catholicism, the traditional
Irish.
Catholicism, Irish Catholicism.
yeah, he doesn't align himself with this Irish traditionalist nationalism, right? He doesn't even want to associate his wife with it. Right? Her family is from Connacht, right? Her people are from there. Right? Not her. Of course she is. She's from Galway, which is right about over here, right? But he doesn't want to think of her as being part of this particular world, right? Now, Gabriel has a kind of counter definition of Irishness, though, right? And I think, Jordan, this is something you were getting at in your presentation. We were talking about his speech, right? What is the subject of the speech that he gives after dinner? What does he seem to regard as the most Irish of qualities in this particular speech? Let's actually, maybe let's just read it. Let's start with page 427, down at the bottom. Can I get somebody to start reading from "Ladies and Gentlemen, it is not the first time we have gathered together."
Ladies and gentlemen, it is not the first time that we have gathered together under this hospitable roof, around this hospitable board. It is not the first time that we have been the recipients, or perhaps I had better say the victims, of the hospitality of certain good ladies. He made a circle in the air with his arm and paused. Everyone laughed or smiled at Aunt Kate and Aunt Julia and Mary Jane, who all turned crimson with pleasure. Gabriel went on more boldly. I feel more strongly with every recurring year that our country has no tradition which does it so much honor and which it should guard so jealously as that of its hospitality. It is a tradition that is unique as far as my experience goes, and I have visited not a few places abroad among the modern nations. Some would say perhaps that with us it is rather a failing than anything to be boasted of. But granted even that, it is to my mind a princely failing, and one that I trust will long be cultivated among us. Of one thing at least I am sure. As long as this one roof shelters the good ladies aforesaid, and I wish from my heart it may do so for many and many a long year to come, the tradition of genuine, warm-hearted, courteous Irish hospitality, which our forefathers have handed down to us, and which we in turn must hand down to our descendants, is still alive among us.
Okay, thank you. So what's he taking as his theme here? Yeah, this idea of hospitality, right? And what does it mean to be hospitable? What is hospitality?
Like being polite whenever people visit, taking care of them while they're there.
Yeah, it's essentially an attitude towards welcoming others, right? And yeah, as you were saying, it's caring for a guest, right? Making sure that they have everything they need, making sure they feel comfortable, right? So if you are demonstrating hospitality, right, you're taking care of a guest. What, by definition, is a guest in your home? Yeah, a visitor, right? Yeah, an outsider. Good. Yeah, someone who's not part of the family, right? Someone who isn't part of the clan. So, by emphasizing hospitality here, what is Gabriel arguing the Irish should be proudest of?
That people want to come visit.
Yeah, the people want to come visit here because they'll be welcomed, right? This is a place where outsiders are received and welcomed and taken care of, not excluded. Now, was this what he was originally going to talk about? What prompted him to give this little speech about hospitality?
Miss Ivers.
Yeah, his little exchange with Miss Ivers, right? This is something he came up with on the fly to get back at her for making him uncomfortable, right? And he refers to her then in the next paragraph of the speech, right? He says, a new generation is growing up in our midst, a generation actuated by new ideas and new principles. It is serious and enthusiastic for these new ideas, and its enthusiasm, even when it is misdirected, is, I believe in the main, sincere. But we are living in a skeptical and, if I may use the phrase, a thought-tormented age. We see here Gabriel's tendency to recycle his own phrases. This is also a phrase he used in his review of Robert Browning. But with Miss Ivers gone, the only other person in the room who's actually read his review isn't there, right? And sometimes I fear that this new generation, educated or hyper-educated as it is, will lack those qualities of humanity, of hospitality, of kindly humor which belonged to an older day. Listening tonight to the names of all those great singers of the past, it seemed to me, I must confess, that we were living in a less spacious age. Those days might, without exaggeration, be called spacious days. And if they are gone beyond recall, let us hope, at least, that in gatherings such as this, we shall still speak of them with pride and affection, still cherish in our hearts the memory of those dead and gone great ones, whose fame the world will not willingly let die. Nice speech, right? Eloquent, articulate. Well done, Mr. Conroy. But how seriously do you think we are supposed to take Gabriel and his viewpoint? Especially when we think about what motivated this speech. Does the story want us to agree with Gabriel? You're shaking your head no, Jordan. Why not? Why do you think not?
I don't think so, because he did it out of anger.
Yeah, he does this out of spite, right? And is the object of his spite even present to hear it? Now, Miss Ivers has already left, right? She's already gone. So, one thing to note about Joyce and about Joyce's style. Well, actually, several things to note about Joyce. So, Joyce is part of the kind of second generation of writers who are grouped into this Irish literary revival. And his concerns are a little bit different. So the second wave of Irish revival writers are concerned primarily with questioning the nationalist assumptions and the rural peasant myth of the first wave. So on the surface, this would actually kind of sound like the story wants us to sympathize with Gabriel. And on some level, it probably does, right? But this certainly kind of seems more in Gabriel's wheelhouse here. And this wave of writers, this generation of writers, tended to prefer urban subject matter. Right, so they're not writing about the West anymore. They're writing primarily about Dublin or Belfast or Cork or other large Irish cities. There's a lot less supernaturalism. So you won't find a lot of direct references to Irish mythology or folklore typically in these second wave writers who are a little bit more realist in some of their assumptions. Although there are actually lots of references to folklore practices in the story. One in particular, don't let me let you go without sharing with you. So if I forget to mention Women's Christmas, remind me at the end of class. They also tend to be formally experimental in their writing in ways that the earlier revival writers typically weren't. So, for example, Joyce's short stories typically lack a traditional sense of closure, right? you don't have like there's the crisis at the climax, and then a denouement that leads to the end, right? That doesn't really usually happen in a Joyce story. What Joyce stories are usually built around are what Joyce called an epiphany. Does anybody know what an epiphany is? What it means to have an epiphany?
It's like that,
Yeah, like in everyday language, it's when you have an epiphany, it's when you have this kind of like the sudden realization hits you, right? Yeah, and that's kind of the way Joyce is using the word as well. So for Joyce, an epiphany is a moment in which people or things reveal their true character. So at what point in the story do you think Gabriel Conroy has his epiphany?
At the end.
Okay.
Say after he was expecting things to go a different way when they got back to the hotel.
Yeah, and just again, like typically, we again, like we're all adults. We're like, what does Gabriel think is going to happen when he and Greta get back to the hotel room?
they're gonna have fun.
Yeah, he's thinking, okay, like our hearts are beating together, our blood is pumping together, right? We are completely in sync, and we are going to go back to that hotel room. Like the kids are back at home in the suburbs, the nanny's watching them, and we are going to have the best sex of our lives, right? And then what actually happens?
She started crying.
Yeah, she starts crying. As soon as he is about to make his move, right, she starts crying. And what is she crying about?
The song she heard it was in Fathomable.
Yeah, the song that was playing at the beginning of class here, it's an old Irish folk song. But yeah, the tenor, Bartle Darcy, sings this song at the end of the party as everybody's going home. And this is stuck with her because she remembers a boy she knew when she was a girl in Galway who used to sing this song to her, right? And so this kind of brings Gabriel's picture of himself kind of crashing down, right? Gabriel Conroy is not confident, cosmopolitan, reviewer of books, aesthete, and man of intellect. Gabriel Conroy is, page 437. Can I get somebody to read for us, starting with, it's the last paragraph on the page. Gabriel felt humiliated by the failure of his irony.
Gabriel felt humiliated by the failure of his irony and by their
Evocation, yep.
of this figure from the dead, a boy in the gasworks, while he had been full of memories of their secret life together, full of tenderness and joy and desire. She had been comparing him in her mind with another. The shameful consciousness of his own person assailed him. He saw himself as a ludicrous figure acting as a penny boy for his aunts, a nervous, well-meaning sentimentalist, orating to vulgarians, the
Idealizing.
his own clownish lusts. The pitiable, fatuous fellow he had caught a glimpse of in the mirror. Instinctively, he turned his back more to the light, lest she might see the shame that burned upon his forehead.
So how does he see himself now?
With more confidence.
Yeah, his confidence, which has been taking a beating over the course of the night, over the course of the party, right? Each time he interacts with a woman, it seems like it's a failure. There's first the bitter exchange with Lily, the caretaker's daughter. There's the argument with Miss Ivers, and now, finally, this complete misreading of his wife's mood and his realization that oh, hey, she actually had a life in which things happened to her before we ever met, right? And he now feels ridiculous. And we can kind of see him throughout the party kind of ready to jump up and serve whenever his aunts call him, right? This is the whole acting as a penny boy for his aunts things. Right? Oh, Gabriel carved the goose. Oh, Gabriel guide Freddie Malins upstairs. He's probably drunk, right? Gabriel, take care of this, take care of that. And so, he now sees himself at the end of the story in a different light. Right? Like the confidence of the cosmopolitan aesthete here is not just shaken, it's shattered. And I think that we also kind of need to kind of pair this with the way Gabriel looks at the world through most of the story. So let's go back to the very beginning and the physical description we get of him. And where the hell is he? Okay, here on page 413. Can I get somebody to read the paragraph that starts with, "He was a stout, tallish young man"?
He was a stout, tallish young man. The high color of his cheeks pushed upwards even to his forehead, where it scattered itself in a few formless patches of pale red, and on his hairless face there scintillated restlessly polished lenses and the bright gilt rims of the glasses which screened his delicate and restless eyes. His glossy black hair was parted in the middle and brushed in a long curve behind his ears, where it curled slightly beneath the groove left by his hat.
Okay, thank you. So let's just take a minute with this physical description of Gabriel. And do you notice any particular things that stand out or that seem to add up to a pattern in his appearance? For example, what are we told about his face? What specific information about his face are we given?
Primarily about the coloration
Okay.
of his cheeks, like expand.
Okay, the coloration on his cheeks, right? And what else? What else are we told about his face?
It's
Hairless. Hairless face. So what does a hairless face on a man indicate?
That he doesn't have puberty.
Okay, if the hair does not grow naturally, right? But hairlessness indicates youth, right? Right. A man has stubble or a beard, right? Try to control it as we might. And a boy has a hairless face. So his appearance is boyish. Right, he's a stout, tallish, young man. Now, what else do we know? Like, what's resting on his face? What does he look at the world through?
Glasses.
Yeah, our attention is also drawn to his glasses, right? So, whenever Gabriel looks at something, is he looking at it directly? He's always looking at it at a slight remove because of these polished glasses, right? So he looks at everything through a distance or remove. And so we see him throughout the story having these kinds of like aesthetic meditations while other people are doing things, right? So, for example, the paragraph we skipped in his conversation with Miss Ivers, right? When he talks about books. on page 419. Right. A look of perplexity appeared on Gabriel's face. It was true that he wrote a literary column every Wednesday in the Daily Express, for which he was paid 15 shillings. But that did not make him a West Briton, surely. The books he received for review were almost more welcome than the paltry check. He loved to feel the covers and turn over the pages of newly printed books. So what does Gabriel like about books?
The news smell.
Yeah, he likes that new book smell and that feel, right? He likes the sensation of touching, of handling a book, right? Further on, when he is watching Greta listen to Bartle D'Arcy sing that song, page 432. He stood still in the gloom of the hall, trying to catch the air that the voice was singing and gazing up at his wife. There was a grace and mystery in her attitude, as if she were a symbol of something. He asked himself, what is a woman standing on the stairs in the shadow, listening to distant music, a symbol of? If he were a painter, he would paint her in that attitude. Her blue felt hat would show off the bronze of her hair against the darkness, and the dark panels of her skirt would show off the light ones. Distant music, he would call the picture if he were a painter. So this is where his sexy feelings towards Greta for the evening begin, right? And what's weird about the way they begin? How is he imagining her as he looks at her standing on the staircase? Okay, like a painting, right? Or like a model for a painting. Or yeah, he's looking at how the colors fit together, right?
It's almost angelic. Because he said that he would paint her against the darkness. Like it's almost like she's like lit up.
Yeah, he likes the color contrast here, the contrast in brightness, right? The blue and the whites. He called the painting distant music.
It feels like it's like a mystery to him, something undiscovered, something new, kind of like he was in the books.
Yeah, it's a new experience, right?
Yeah.
And the important thing here too is that it's an aesthetic experience, right? He kind of like makes her into an abstraction. Like, this is not my wife, this is a painting, this is an aesthetic object. This is a pretty thing for me to muse on through my polished, scintillating glasses, right? And even when he's thinking about their secret life together as they're on their way to the hotel, right? He's thinking about things like the color and the smell of an envelope, right? Or, some little secret thing they said to each other on a train platform, the press of her hand in a particular situation. So Gabriel's thoughts tend to revolve around sense impressions. Now, what do we remember, perhaps, was the term for intense sensitivity to sense impressions? Sensibility. Good, yes. So yeah, he is a person of high sensibility, right? Because this is something that was really kind of coming back into vogue at the end of the 19th century due to the work of an art historian by the name of Walter Pater. And I'm just going to quote to you a little bit from Pater's book, Studies in the History of the Renaissance. So the conclusion to this book was highly influential in artistic circles. And Pater wrote in this conclusion, right, to burn always with this hard gem-like flame, to maintain this ecstasy is success in life. In a sense, it might even be said that our failure is to form habits. For after all, habit is relative to a stereotyped world, and meantime it is only the roughness of the eye that makes any two persons, things, situations seem alike. While all melts under our feet, we may well grasp at any exquisite passion or any contribution to knowledge that seems by a lifted horizon to set the spirit free for a moment, or any stirring of the senses, strange dyes, strange colors, and curious odors, or work of the artist's hands, or the face of one's friend. So Pater's basic argument is that we live in a world of just kind of constantly shifting sense impressions, right? That, everything just kind of runs through our fingers like a sieve, like through a sieve. We can't hold on to anything. But what we need to try to do is take these moments of intense sensory pleasure and crystallize them in memory and try to hold on to them. And that is, in particular, aesthetic success, right? And that seems to be the kind of philosophy that Gabriel mostly lives by until he has this crushing moment with his wife and then looks out the window towards the west, right? So we don't have too much time to tease this out. It seems like there is some kind of rapprochement at the end between his early cosmopolitanism and nationalism. I will leave you to think about what that might be. This might actually be something that could show up on the final exam, so this might be something worth thinking through. But I did also promise before I let you go that I would explain to you what Women's Christmas was. So the Mrs. Morgan's party, right, it's a Christmas party, right? But it's not taking place on Christmas. Right? For how many days in the Victorian and post-Victorian period did people tend to celebrate Christmas? Pardon?
12?
Yes, exactly. And so the last night of the Christmas season, which is sometimes just called Twelfth Night, was in Ireland called Nollaig na mBan. Nollaig is Christmas, Ban is woman, so Nollaig na mBan, women's Christmas. So, on Nollaig na mBan, the usual gender hierarchy was suspended. Right, women hosted parties, and men performed household tasks. And goose, as is served at the party here, was the traditional main course. And I think a lot of what's going on here is, Gabriel coming into a Nollaig na mBan party, a women's Christmas party, and thinking that he's the primary actor in the scene, when in fact he's being acted upon by all of the women around him. So there is that kind of power reversal in the gender dynamic throughout the story. So does anybody have any questions about this before I let y'all go? Okay, so I'm going to give you the reading questions for next time, and then those of you who did get an email from me about making up quizzes, come see me in class.